Welcome to the Free Marketeers, the official podcast of the Free Market Foundation.
Hello, dear listeners. This is the latest episode of the Free Marketeers podcast. I am joined by Martin van Staden and Chris Hattingh. So I think we'll just jump right into it and talk about the budget yet again. I know that Chris has already done something on his own podcast about the budget, but maybe we could just talk about some of the things said and things not said in the budget. So let's start with you, maybe Chris.
Well, as I mentioned on my podcast, I don't think I covered all the points, and the biggest one probably was on education. The fact that was the biggest item, the biggest spend in the budget, which I found surprising.
Did you?
I found it surprising that was the biggest spend, because we see increases in spending on education every year, but the quality doesn't change. So now I think now that it's the biggest item, surely now they're going to fix education, right?
Well, we've been spending more on education per capita, I think, more than like the United States and many European countries for years now. I think in 2016, The Economist magazine said that few countries in the world spend so much on education to so little effect. And I mean, that's the case here. I think education has been the biggest or one of the biggest items on the budget.
It's been the biggest,
for many years now, and it's completely it's a waste of money. We basically set all that money alight when we do that, because it's based on this fallacy that the problem goes away when you throw enough money at it, and that has clearly shown not to be true with our spending on education. So I'm not surprised at all. The government still hasn't gotten away from this idea that you need to actually have a structural reform in the system to solve the education crisis, like vouchers, encouraging private schools, maybe charter schools, whatever. But this state-centric thing of public schools that are always going to fail. And please, this narrative that we just need better people, come on. Let's get over it, people. It's not going to happen. We need a structural reform. We're wasting all that money that we're spending on education, so let's get over that.
I think it's the same kind of principle as with state-owned enterprises. We get told that they're going to have new boards and new CEOs, and they'll, Eskom is again going to get the 23 billion rand every year for the next 3 years, but that doesn't mean there's going to be structural changes, just new people in charge.
Yeah, that's true. And just on Eskom, the finance minister has been going through a series of interviews ever since the budget, and one of the things that sort of slipped out when that process was going on was that we might be spending this 23 billion over the next 10 years actually. So because the budgets, when they do the budget, they only present the figures, the projected figures for the next 3 years,
right,
the MTEF period, but they might have other plans for beyond that. And so he was trying to reassure, I think, the rating agencies. And you basically, because they know the rating agencies are not stupid, they know that Eskom is not sustainable. So if government has no plans to get rid of it, then obviously they must have a plan to support it somehow. So
wait, so you mean after the 69 billion rand that it's going to get for the next 3 years, that won't be the final bailout?
Yeah, it could be. It could be. The figures I've heard, it could be something as from 150 billion to 230 billion. Depending, 230 billion if they just keep to this 23 billion a year for the full 10 years, but they might also start reducing it. Then in that case, it would be 150 billion. So
which part of the three new components of Eskom are they talking about? Are they talking about generation, distribution, or transmission? Because I thought we're breaking Eskom up into three independent companies. It doesn't sound like it. It seems like we're still treating this idea of the state providing power as one concept. So I mean, this is so I can't get over the fact about how many red herrings are flying around in South Africa, or swimming around, since a herring is a fish, I think. I don't know much about animals.
I think you're right.
Yeah, so it's like, okay, so we're talking about this bailout, everyone's a bit upset about the bailout. It's like, okay, we need to talk about privatization, people.
yeah,
I saw someone complaining on Facebook. He wrote a very long essay basically saying this idea that affirmative action brought down Eskom and all these things, and the contractors are milking it dry. And I was just overcome by a sense of, why are we even talking about this? You're not talking about privatization. The problem in Eskom is incentives. The incentive structure is inherently flawed. As Mpiyakhe has pointed out in an article, Eskom cannot come to correct market prices for electricity, so we're probably underpaying. The whole structure is just wrong. So it's hardly surprising that government is going to be bailing it out. It's going to keep happening, and until you listeners and everyone else start actively punting this idea that we need to get rid of this leech on the taxpayer purse, it's just going to continue itself. So yeah, we need to really cut through the nonsense.
Even on the privatization point, because it's sort of a scare word for a lot of people, especially unions, because they're worried about job losses. And because Eskom is so large, and like you said, the state sees itself as it has to be the provider of electricity, even if they just opened up, if NERSA opened up the market to competition, because Eskom right now, no one will take on that debt because it's so huge.
Yeah.
So even if they just open up to competition, then we have the independent power producers driving down costs, and then we can see if Eskom can actually compete on the market, and then we can, so there are ways of, it doesn't mean, when we say privatization, it doesn't mean like we don't care about people's jobs. This is why we care, because of the cost on South Africans, because of Eskom's failures.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree with you, Chris, 100%. And just a few other things from the budgets. One of the most, there'll be 15 billion of extra tax increases this year. One of which is this. We were told that there are no tax increases this year.
Yeah, no individual and corporate.
Exactly, there are no individual. It's only the indirect taxes that are increased. I mean, the new carbon tax, they plan to raise 1.8 billion from that. And so,
not bad. Maybe a bit conservative, but
but there's actually we'll be getting some taxes from inflation, just for the mere fact that people who are near the tax brackets, whenever they get an inflation linked increase, they won't be able to realize that, because if you move from one bracket to the next bracket because of an increase, then the government will just basically be getting all of that,
right?
Because of inflation, because you'll now be paying extra in taxes. And that extra will be close or near to what the actual increase itself. And so basically, government is taking your salary increase.
So you're telling me government is actually very clever in pursuing policies which don't encourage growth and which encourage inflation, because they know they're going to get more in taxes. So they're actually like more strategic than we give them credit for.
Yeah, I mean, this is a stealth tax, as you said, Mpiyakhe. I mean, Minister Mboweni went up in front of Parliament and he thought he got away with it by not saying that there will be an increase in personal income taxes. And technically it's correct. There is going to be no increase, but they've also not adjusted the brackets with inflation of what's inflation, 6 or 7% up. So by not doing that, hundreds of thousands, maybe, I don't know, if the government gets very lucky, millions of South Africans will be pushed into a higher tax bracket, and they'll get more. And all that without the minister actually announcing an increase. So yeah, the government is quite sneaky, and that is why you have organizations like the Free Market Foundation, independent economists like Dawie Ruet and so forth, to point these things out. I think the first people who pointed this out, to me at least, was Sakeliga, formerly known as Agribusiness, so Piet Leroux. They basically said, no, personal income taxes actually were increased. You just didn't notice it, and this is how they did it. So yeah, the speech by the minister is usually, I would say, meant to deceive us into probably being a bit more positive than we should be. But yeah, I'm the cynic around here, so don't take everything out.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the other tax that's increased was the medical tax credit, basically through the same mechanism, sort of, because they didn't adjust it for inflation. They left it unchanged. So the last year's medical tax credit was 310 rands. By leaving it unchanged, basically they have reduced it, and then they'll be raising 1 billion rands from not adjusting it according to inflation. So that's 13.8 billion rands, and then the rest of it comes from indirect taxes. So it's going to be some interesting times, and just looking at the deficit, that's how it's set to increase the interest, the money that you have to spend servicing debt and all of that. It seems that we might be getting more tax increases, And speaking of tax increases, Martina, you recently wrote something about a sugar tax.
Yeah, no, I just to tell you listeners, my article was misreported on in the Citizen of today, Friday. In my article, I drew attention to the fact that the 360,000 people who are reliant on the sugar industry, it's beverages, catering, and so forth, there may be some job losses in that industry, and we have seen this with Coca-Cola, which I think have announced they're going to cut 1,000 or 1,500 jobs throughout their value chain. I've personally heard about other stories as well, bottling companies and so forth that are retrenching dozens of employees, mostly due to the sugar tax, And the sugar tax was implemented, I believe, in April last year, 2018. Basically as a sin tax, trying to dissuade people from buying sugary products because Minister Aaron Motsoaledi of the Health Department really hates fun and hates recreation and hates people actually satisfying their desires and so forth. But yeah, so in the article I also pointed out the fact that the sugar tax, in my view, is actually unconstitutional because it not only infringes on South Africans' right to choose and so forth, but also it's an inequality, a violation of the Section 9 right to equality, basically because the poor, as you know, have less disposable income than more wealthier people, and therefore on, for example, a can of Coca-Cola, proportionately they pay more for the sugar tax than would a person with more money. So basically the poor have been prohibited from having a sweet tooth, which is actually quite devastating. If you're poor, you're not allowed to buy Coca-Cola because you're going to be paying more in taxes, and if you're wealthy, then you can still carry on buying Coca-Cola. And as you know, listeners, the Coca-Cola brands, all of them have reduced the size of their cans, but not the price of their product. So that was basically the sugar tax. Now I mentioned the thing with the Citizen. Now they reported that I implied or said that 360,000 people are going to lose their jobs. That is not what I said. I said that they are exposed to this problem with the sugar tax. And I mean, the Cane Growers Association, farmers and so forth have started coming out and saying that it's basically the sugar tax that it's making our problem so big. So yeah, my article is basically just about that. It is available on the Free Market Foundation's website, so please have a look there, and we will put it in the description below.
And yeah, no, that's very interesting. And just on my side, I think it's misguided for government to be trying to sort of regulate people's behavior based on their own arbitrary standards. I mean, like they might say that health is important or whatever, but surely the individual would know better than government officials what's important for them.
I think if it's so important to Minister Motsoaledi, they would spend more money on education, for example, if they want to do studies on the impact of sugar, that sort of thing, and then give people the information and let people decide for themselves.
Yeah.
And what you said, Martin, on it's being discriminatory against poorer people, it's the same. We see the impact of these policies disproportionately more on poor people, especially labor policies, because it's harder for poorer people to get into the job market. So this is just another instance of government, the apparently noble intentions of policies have the very opposite effect, and it's sort of a vicious cycle, so it's going to repeat itself.
Yes.
Yeah. And so the other thing that I wanted to talk about was some interesting comments made by Minister Mboweni during the pre-budget media thing. I forgot what they call it.
Pre-media red carpet.
Yeah, where they have the media there, and basically he labeled state-owned enterprises as Soviet relics. I wonder how that will go down amongst his alliance partners in the ANC.
I think he might have been wrapped across the fingers for that one.
Yeah, geez. I mean, as everyone knows, the governing party has a history of cooperation with the Soviet Union and moreover with communist China during the struggle against apartheid. So it's quite brave for the Minister of Finance to say state-owned enterprises are Soviet-era relics. And it may even be quite controversial amongst those people who still today think the apartheid government was some kind of bastion of capitalism and Western democracy, that everything worked so well and it was private enterprise and people were free under that system, which is a perverse idea to hold. But yes, he's essentially correct. The apartheid government, with all its anti-communist legislation, was essentially being communist with these state-owned enterprises. I mean, Eskom owned mines. The government literally owned the means of production in certain instances. So state-owned enterprises in South Africa are complete socialist entities. And if we really want to break from the past, as Tito Mboweni is implying, we need to move over to a system that respects freedom and enterprise. And that means these state companies need to be if not closed down, then unbundled and privatized. And I'm going to keep using that P word that everyone hates so much, but expect some more of that from me.
And Chris, what do you think about the minister's complaints? I know that you are the guy who always says it's important to make the sort of the ethical case for liberty. So what's... Were you excited at all?
Now you're really putting me on the spot. Yeah, I think the majority understanding maybe of radical economic transformation is that all these policies, the NHI, for example, the SOEs, government needs to run these things because of the interest of the poor, because they're radical, they're going to transform the economy for the majority of South Africans. But there's nothing radical about, for example, the SOEs, because they continue the tradition of keeping things in the hands of the state. So it's completely consistent with history, the majority of history, where governments try and control people's lives. I don't think the only radical part of history we can say, if you take like that grand view, for example, is capitalism, is freedom and liberty. That's the only thing that goes completely the other direction of, it's a 180 from the continued attempts by governments to control people's lives. So in that way, like you said, the ethical case for liberty in and of itself, if you talk about the pragmatic case, it simply works based. And then it's in the best interest of people's lives. They might make mistakes and that kind of thing, but at least they're going to be free.
And if I just can make a point on that continuation of history, I've been reading a lot about mining recently. In 1936, I believe, Mpiyakhe Dhlamini, the then next or upcoming prime minister of South Africa, a very big supporter of apartheid, was addressing a conference of Afrikaner nationalists, and told them that the policy of the National Party would be to nationalize the mines so as to undermine capitalists. As you know, the NP was very much against what it saw as English capital and so forth. And that the NP promised that 1948, its electoral platform basically said the mines in South Africa will be nationalized for the benefit of all of South Africa, regardless of race. It decided against that when it saw investors and mining houses saying, we'll be gone if you try that. So,
see you in another 100 years.
So they didn't do that, but they did intervene a lot in the mining industry, passing very intrusive legislation and so forth. And then in the 1980s, the Conservative Party, which basically made the NP look like a bunch of liberals, Conservative Party became the official opposition in 1988. Very, very pro-apartheid party was saying that if it should come into power, one of the first things it will do will be to nationalize the mines and nationalize mineral resources in South Africa for the benefit of everyone. And then that, of course, didn't happen because we achieved democracy. And the promise of the currently ruling government was to nationalize the minerals and nationalize the mines, and they did. They nationalized the minerals in 2000. There is a nice straight line of rhetoric right out of the apartheid era, from the regime of that era to the government we live under today, all supporting the nationalization of minerals. Not one of them support private ownership of minerals. It is all the same story. History repeats itself.
No, not to get sidetracked or anything, but I think that's an interesting point that both of you guys have raised here. So can we say that basically the ANC government just removed the racial aspects of apartheid but kept everything else. Is it fair to say that?
I would say a lot of the logic that underlied apartheid was basically kept unchanged. The constitution changed a lot of things. We're much freer today than we would have been without it. But as far as like just logic of governance goes, most of it was kept. Basically, the state sees itself as the centerpiece in society, and everything else should happen around it rather than it being a supportive structure that helps around the periphery where people fall through cracks. So yeah, I would say the bulk of apartheid government logic was just kept, modified around the edges.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I agree. We do need radical reform now. But on to hopefully happier matters. A common friend of all of ours, all three of us here, has just gotten their first book released. Okay, their first book as an individual author. I think they may have co-written some few things before in the past. So, Martin, like, what do you think about this friend's book, the book on the introduction to the rule of law?
Yeah, no, I think our friend worked a long time.
By the way, Martin van Staden is the one who wrote the book, so in case someone is confused right now.
Yes, so...
I thought that was a pseudonym. I thought that was another Martin van Staden.
No, yeah. So my book, The Constitution and the Rule of Law, an Introduction, arrived today, the printed version. It's going to be at the Free Market Foundation, available for anyone who pitches up at the office. It's also available for free as a PDF. It's on the Rule of Law Project's website. It's www.ruleoflaw.org.za, and then click on the word book. So basically, my book is a general introduction to this concept of the rule of law, which is found in Section 1C of the Constitution, which is also where I got the title of my book. Section 1C of the Constitution says that South Africa is founded upon the following values, and 1C is the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. So that is where I got the title. Basically exploring the idea that not only the text of the Constitution in South Africa is supreme, but also the doctrine of the rule of law, which the Constitution says is co-equally supreme with itself. But that has not happened in our courts, and government and the parliament have completely ignored this aspect of the Constitution by, for example, enacting legislation that is unclear, contradictory with other legislation, assigning very broad discretionary powers to government officials, basically to make law as they go along, giving ministers the power to enact, quote, regulations, but which are in fact laws in and of themselves. These are all things that are inconsistent with the rule of law, and in my view, and I argue extensively for this in the book, are also unconstitutional in the same way that anything else like racist legislation would be unconstitutional. So yeah, if you're interested in exploring, reading about untapped part of South Africa's legal discourse, this thing about the rule of law and its position in our society, or if you're just looking to understand what this term that a lot of politicians always talk about, the rule of law, we need to restore the rule of law, if you want to know what that really means, I would encourage you to pick up the book. It was written for a general audience, so I hope you wouldn't find the legalese of it too daunting. So please pick it up.
Before we get off before we finish the podcast, I just wanted to ask you like one more question, like on just on the rule of law. So can you just tell us a little bit, Martina, why the rule of law is important and what it means, like in as concise way as you can?
All right, so
good luck, Martin.
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot with that one. It's been insanely difficult for legal scholars to actually define what the rule of law means. So it's often described as the rule of law is the opposite of the rule of man. Basically, the way I describe it in the book is that the rule of law is an aversion to arbitrariness. So in essence, the rule of law is a prohibition, a legal idea, a legal force, basically, that prohibits arbitrariness in legislation, in regulations, in government conduct, basically saying that if you, as parliament, as the courts, as the courts and the executive, do anything, you need to do it with reasons, reasons that are based in your mandate as your institution. If you're parliament, you need to make law in terms of a specific section of the constitution. You need to justify what you're doing, and you need to do it in a clear way so that everyone who is touched by what you are doing understands perfectly what you are saying you're doing. There's no hidden agenda like a lot of legislation that we do have, which basically is about increasing the power of the state, but which says it's for the good of the nation. That is a hidden agenda. If you want to increase the power of the state, that's fine. Say in the legislation we want to increase the power.
Own it. Come on, if it's such a good thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, just say it. You need to be clear about what you're doing. It shouldn't be legalese. I mentioned the discretionary powers thing. We elect parliament to make law for us. We do not elect the guy sitting in the basement at some department in Pretoria who just writes some notes down and suddenly that is law that governs us. He is not elected, so he should not have the authority to make law for anyone, and he should definitely not have the authority to hear a case like a judge and then just say, yes, I decide this with discretionary power. So it's a prohibition on arbitrariness. We as citizens should know exactly how we are governed. We should never be uncertain about what government is doing or what it's going to do next or what the outcome of a case can be, except if we're in court, of course, there needs to be arguments. But as far as we're dealing with parliament and the executive at least, there needs to be a whole lot of certainty and clarity, basically. So reasonableness, essentially. That's a convoluted way of describing the rule of law, but
I think it's a good summary. I mean, if someone wants to learn more, they'll need to get the book.
Yes.
But then
Martin, sorry, Mpiyakhe, I think he answered your question quite well. I look forward to reading about the philosophy of the rule of law in his book.
There's a bit of that in there. Maybe I'll explore it deeper in a future book. Don't worry. Yeah.
So, but my last thing before we close, I promise it's the last thing. So I wanted just to get a sense of why the rule of law is important.
Okay, well, so the rule of law basically, as the chairman of our Rule of Law Board of Advisors, Judge Rex van Schalkwyk, who wrote the foreword to my book, would say his definition of the rule of law, which is useful for some purposes, is that the rule of law is a barrier that the law erects against tyranny. So it's basically all about defending the people, whether you want to conceive of them as individuals or as communities, from the heteronormative power of the state. Basically, it's to say that this is the state has its role to play. Some might disagree with that, fair enough. And there are individuals, and the rule of law is the thing that stands between the abuse of power of the state and individuals. But then, of course, more practically, the rule of law is very important to the economy. If there are too many discretionary powers, companies simply do not know what their regulators are going to do. A company may not even criticize their regulator because the regulator has the discretion to, for example, not give them a permit. So if you're in mining, we talked about mining earlier, you under the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, you have to get a permit to do everything. Prospect for minerals, mine for minerals, distribute minerals. You need a permit for each of those things. And if you, as a CEO of a company, say something that the minister who is responsible for giving you that permit does not like, you can kiss your permits goodbye. So the rule of law says there should never be that kind of discretion. That nobody should be able to say, no, you're not going to get a permit now. Essentially, the permit, you should just get a permit, and if the permit is going to be denied, it should be on objective criteria that everyone can understand and can bring about certainty. So the rule of law has very important implications for the economy, but also very much for our individual liberty.
Right, so Martin, you're saying that disrespect of the rule of law engenders an environment for corruption.
Well, yes. So this can we can talk about this for hours, but yeah. So
just a teaser.
Yeah.
But we only have 1 minute to remember, guys.
Everything that you're seeing with state capture right now is at its core because of violation of the rule of law. Basically, everyone who took a bribe and so forth and who gave a tender or something that they shouldn't have given basically had the power to do so in terms of legislation. They had a discretion. So the legislation says that the registrar of this and this may issue a tender to someone in the public interest. That's a discretionary power that's virtually unlimited, and so you should not be surprised that registrar just happens to coincidentally pick the guy who gave him a nice expensive bottle of Blue Label whiskey or
Johnny
something.
Walker,
Yeah, Johnny Walker. So it's just a coincidence.
Or some bribe packs or something.
Yeah, yeah, bribe packs, fish and chips, whatever. A lot of money. That is what happens when you don't have the rule of law.
Yeah.
So you need legislation that does not give anyone this type of discretion, and you'll see corruption virtually vanish, in my view.
I know. I think that's a nice place to end it, and we'll see you guys next week, I guess. And could someone give us the social media? I keep forgetting.
Yeah, and just to remind you, we also have some events coming up.
Oh, yes.
The immediate one, I believe, is next week, Wednesday.
27 February, David Root is going to be giving a talk on the just passed budget. Basically, what are the implications of the budget? And then on the 6th March, we will be getting a special guest, David Coulthard from Zimbabwe, to come speak at the FMF, which would be really special.
Yeah, so check our website out for theirs on the events tab. You'll see both events there. Please RSVP soon for both of them, especially the David Coulthard one. He's a very sought after speaker, very knowledgeable on what's happened in Zimbabwe. So please look at that. Now, of course, subscribe to this YouTube channel. That is the red button right under the video. Follow us on Twitter at FMF South Africa, one word. And like us on Facebook. It's Free Market Foundation South Africa, or in the URL, it's facebook.com/FMFSA. Thank you again for joining us. Cheers.